Hi, I'm Stockton Helbing, and in this video I'm going to go over the basic approaches to my worksheet Intro to Grooves Part 1 and what our expectations are at the University of North Texas for our non-jazz study drum set majors. This worksheet is comprised of two basic components: a melody played between the bass drum and snare drum, and a secondary hi-hat part. We're going to take a look at each of these components first, talk about their techniques, and then put it all together. In most contemporary music in the United States, the bass drum and snare drum are the primary sounds you hear coming from a drum set part. I think of them as the melody. They are the most important parts and therefore should be the most prominent dynamically when you're playing. On the Intro to Grooves worksheet, you have 12 one-measure patterns of bass drum and snare drum that are very commonly found grooves in all types of popular music here in the United States. When you're going through them, you should recognize them. Perhaps you'll recognize them from some songs you really enjoy. Let's talk about techniques first for the bass drum. In most contemporary music styles, the bass drum is a very important part that you will hear reoccurring over and over. It is important that the bass drum be consistent both metronomically in the pattern that it's playing and dynamically. For starters, with the Intro to Grooves worksheet, we're going to treat every bass drum part as if it's being played at a forte volume. The technique that I like to use when playing a forte volume on the bass drum is a bit different than the technique I use for softer styles and dynamics of music, such as the ways I've demonstrated bass drum playing in a jazz or bossa nova context in some of my other videos. When I'm playing a loud contemporary style, I am using a much different approach on the bass drum pedal. Although my resting position is still the same, whenever I am at rest on the bass drum, I have the weight of my leg primarily in the heel, and I do not have the beater pressed fully into the drum head. I'm simply letting the natural weight of the pedal support the ball of my foot and have the beater away from the head. When I go to play a note, I am first going to prepare by lifting up my leg. That preparatory stroke is very important, and we'll talk about a little bit later on how that preparatory foot stroke needs to also be metronomically placed in time. I lift up then and am prepared to come down with a stroke to generate a lot of volume. So my heel lifts up first, where the weight of my leg is supported on the ball of my foot. And then in one smooth motion, I transfer the weight to my heel and then bring the ball of my foot back down, creating a loud forte stroke on the bass drum. I kind of jokingly refer to this as a molar stroke with my foot. It takes a little bit of practice, but just like a good backbeat on the snare drum, which I'll talk about soon, the entirety of the leg is involved. You will feel motion throughout all of the leg, and you want to make sure that after the stroke occurs, you allow the beater to return to a resting position. You do not want to push the beater into the head, as that can affect both the pitch and resonance of the bass drum when you're playing a groove. The snare drum is the second important part of the melody in a contemporary groove. There are a couple basic ways you can strike the snare drum, and this is very confusing to a lot of people. So I want to break down what our expectations are for snare drum playing on this Intro to Grooves worksheet. We are going to be using a rim shot articulation whenever we strike the snare drum. And that means for a good quality rim shot sound, we're going to be playing rim shots where we're still aiming to keep the beat of the stick striking in the very center of the snare drum, or maybe ever so slightly close to your backbeat hand. You do not want to pull your stick back too far so that you're getting very little stick contact above the placement of your stick striking the rim. You really want to aim for the center. And we want to make sure also that we have a very smooth, consistent stroke in the hand that is playing the backbeat. So if you're a traditional grip player such as myself, you'll see that really it's the butt of the stick that leads the upstroke. and that I have a very nice, relaxed, consistent motion. A good backbeat is going to involve what I refer to as 3 points of articulation on the arm being involved. The wrist, 1, the elbow, 2, and the shoulder, this ball and socket, 3. These are the 3 points of articulation that all should work gently in conjunction to create a great backbeat sound. And we also want to make sure that the snare drum is played at a forte dynamic as well. And we want it to be rhythmically accurate as much as it is dynamically accurate. This will help the snare drum match the intensity and volume that we're creating in our bass drum, and thereby giving us a strong rhythmic melody in our groove. Now that we've gone over the basic techniques to playing bass drum and snare drum, you can start by putting these groove melodies together. I think it's a good idea to practice each one of these 12 grooves with just your bass drum, snare drum, and a metronome to make sure that you have them sounding excellent with proper and good techniques. Remember that they are the primary sounds, the primary voices in contemporary styles of drum set playing, so it is imperative that they sound excellent. Now, let's talk about the hi-hat and what its role is going to be as we play through this worksheet. At the top of the worksheet, you will see that there are 3 different eighth note hi-hat patterns labeled A, B, and C. These are the most basic hi-hat patterns that you can use to help play contemporary grooves at the drum set. I purposely chose these to make it very simple, hopefully, for everyone to hit the ground running and having fun playing some of these contemporary grooves. Let's look at the techniques that are involved with playing a proper hi-hat pattern in a contemporary drum set situation. The hi-hat is a secondary voice when we're playing contemporary grooves at the drum set. It's important that we do not overplay it dynamically and let it spoil the sound of our groove by overshadowing the bass drum and the snare drum. In hi-hat pattern A, which is the first pattern on the worksheet, you'll see that there are all eighth notes with accents above them. We're going to create a nice accented hi-hat sound by making sure we contact the hi-hat with the side of the stick below the taper on the edge of the closed hi-hat. This will give us a nice, consistent, and dark hi-hat sound. It's important that we have the hi-hat closed firmly, but we don't want to strain while doing so. You'll want to make sure that you have your hi-hat positioned in such a way that your knee is directly above your ankle, so that the natural weight of your leg can help keep the hi-hat closed nice, tight, and consistently. Then when we strike the hi-hat, we want to make sure we have our hi-hat playing hand positioned in such a way that roughly our first knuckle is on top. That way we are using that wrist hinge the way it's designed, similar to as if you were dribbling a basketball. You can do this consistently, nearly endlessly, with no problems. One common issue that I encounter with students when doing hi-hat work in these contemporary drumming situations is that they put their thumb on top, which then rotates their arm and causes them to either flare their elbow out or tuck it into their side, and it leads to a whole bunch of issues in this part of their arm and then in the movement patterns of their backbeat hand. So you want to always use your body as safely and ergonomically as possible so that you do not injure yourself and that you can play with the most consistent technique possible. So you want to have that nice, roughly first knuckle on top placement of your right arm, and you want to make sure you're striking at that sweet spot, fat portion of the stick below the taper on the side of the hi-hat for a nice, consistent eighth note sound. Let's look at hi-hat pattern B now. We'll see that on the worksheet you have accents only over downbeats and unaccented notes on the upbeats. So on the accented downbeats, you will use the same technique that we used in hi-hat A. You'll make sure that you're striking the hi-hat with the stick below the taper on the edge of the cymbal. For unaccented notes, we're simply going to want to strike the hi-hat roughly halfway between its edge and the center with the tip of the stick. So on the upbeats, the and of 1, and of 2, and the and of 3, we will have that subtle technique. So you will see that your wrist is very involved in the way these strokes are generated. But you will also see that there is no horizontal movement in the positioning of your arm and hand when creating this. One of the common issues I see is that students are either pulling back so that the tip is too close to the edge of the cymbal for their unaccented notes, or they're hitting so hard for their accented notes that they're moving forward and striking too low on the stick and then getting weird glancing blows when they go to do their unaccented notes. You want to make sure you stay roughly in the same area with no horizontal motion, only vertical motion, and that gentle breaking of the wrist to help generate the differential in those two techniques. Finally, hi-hat pattern C is very similar to B in that we have unaccented and accented notes alternating. We've simply changed the position of them. Now all downbeats will be unaccented notes, which means tip in the middle of the cymbal for unaccented eighth note hi-hat sounds. And then for the accents on the upbeats, we will go to the full side of the stick on the edge of the cymbal. It's important to remember that yet again, you want to have proper placement, a first knuckle on top, using that wrist, making sure that there are no strange angles occurring in the elbow, and as always, sitting up nice, tall, proud, and relaxed in the shoulders with chest square to the bass drum to ensure that you're properly balanced in your physical placement at the drum set. Now that we've talked about the basic techniques for playing bass drum, snare drum, and hi-hat for this Intro to Grooves Part 1 worksheet, it's time to put everything together into the full groove. I recommend that everyone always begins with hi-hat A at a very slow tempo. If you look in the upper left-hand corner of the worksheet, you will see that I have a recommended tempo range of 60 to 120 beats per minute. You should always start at the slowest marked tempo. Because remember, if you cannot play something slowly and accurately, you will never play it quickly and accurately. So start slowly. If 60 beats per minute still seems too fast to you, no problem. Slow it down. We are all different. We all learn at different speeds. I myself am a slow learner. I need to practice things very slowly so that I can think about everything that I'm playing and how it relates to each other and how it will relate to the musicians I'm performing with. So if you need to go to 55, 50, 40 beats per minute, there is no shame in that. There's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, it shows wisdom and it shows a very keen mind when practicing. So you'll want to take groove number 1, where bass drum plays on beats 1 and 3, snare drum plays on beats 2 and 4, and hi-hat is playing all eighth notes in an accented fashion. I recommend that you turn your metronome on to your selected tempo and you play that for at least 8 measures consecutively without starting. I also like to hold myself accountable in practicing by doing each groove for 5 minutes at a time with as little errors as possible to make sure that I can maintain that repetitive groove with great technique, and also to help training myself to have the mental fortitude and patience that it will take when I start playing music. The average popular music song is anywhere from 4 to 5 minutes, so you will be required in your drumming career to hold down a groove consistently for that duration of time. Start practicing the things you're going to use in your career now, and you'll be really glad that you did. I recommend that you go through all 12 grooves with hi-hat A to make sure that you can control all of them before you're moving on. You'll notice that grooves 1 through 4 on your worksheet are based in quarter notes and eighth notes, and then starting with groove number 5, we start introducing 16th note syncopations. If you find the 16th note syncopations challenging, slow it down, count it out. Remember to break it down. Make sure that the bass drum and snare drum can be played accurately without the hi-hat, then reintroduce the hi-hat and see if you're able to control it. Also, try building it in different ways. You can build it by starting with just the hi-hat, get that going, then introduce your bass drum pattern, then finally bringing in the snare drum part. Or you could build it differently by starting with just the bass drum, then adding the snare drum, finally adding the hi-hat. Most students really struggle early on when they try to start all 3 voices simultaneously. They feel very overwhelmed by all of that. I know I did when I was starting out. You have to find ways to practice that you enjoy, and that you know you're taking progressive steps to improvement. So make sure you find out what works best for you by experimenting in the way that you practice. After you've gone through all 12 grooves with all 3 hi-hat patterns and you feel confident that you can play each groove by itself, start practicing them in phrases, moving from one groove to the next. I recommend starting out doing 8 measure phrases. For instance, if you're practicing hi-hat A first with all 12 grooves, you would set your metronome, and then you would do 8 measures of groove number 1 with hi-hat A, and then go immediately into groove number 2, then immediately into groove number 3, with each one being played 8 bars total. Then experiment with different phrase lengths. Practice 4-bar phrases, 8-bar phrases, 12-bar phrases, 16-bar phrases, and then start challenging yourself with odd-numbered phrases to ensure that you're practicing tracking where you are in the song form. The one person in a band who must never, ever be lost is the drummer, because it's the drummer's job not only to keep great time, but to foreshadow musical transitions using fills and setups, which we'll talk about in a later video. So it is very important now that you always know where you are at. I use the old school method of tracking by counting in my mind to 4 every measure and saying the measure number for beat 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4. You get the idea. I've done this for so long that I do not actively think about it, but I did have to actively think about it when I was younger learning to play. It has become a passive concept in my mind, but concepts only become passive through many, many repetitions actively of thinking and practicing them. So start doing that now. Even say it out loud if you feel like starting out. That'll help you keep your place and know where you are in the song form. What I'm going to do now is give you a couple different demonstrations of myself playing some of these different hi-hat patterns and grooves for you to listen to, watch, and practice with if you want. I will put what exactly I'm doing and the tempo at the bottom of the screen for each example. Check it out. I hope that this video has given you some ideas on how you can start practicing, playing, and enjoying contemporary grooves at the drum set. We only need the kick drum, the snare drum, and a hi-hat to get started on this beautiful journey of playing music such as rock and roll, hip-hop, R&B, punk, ska, funk. You get the idea. So I hope that you'll jump right in and have fun knowing that you now have some progressive steps to follow to ensure that you are getting better at playing the drum set. I'll look forward to seeing you next time for another video. Thanks. Shanked that fill. Okay, I might not use that anyway. That'll do it.